Hey guys, welcome to Unit 3, which is on culture. Unit 3 is going to cover chapters 6, 7, and 8 in your AMSCO books. Chapter 6 is really kind of all about cultural basics and folk versus pop culture. Then we are going to learn about language and then religion and ethnicity. So those are the four major concepts for Unit 3. Again, that's folk and pop culture, that is religion, language, and ethnicity. There's a variety of different cultures found throughout the world. Here in the Americas, there was a wide variety of different Native American cultures, and this quote is from a Native American. It says, "The buffalo was part of us, his flesh and blood being absorbed by us until it became our own flesh and blood. Our clothing, our teepees, everything we needed for life came from the buffalo's body. It was hard to say where the animal ended and the human began." So what's going to be true for most folk cultures is the physical environment is going to play a huge role in their actual culture, from everything in terms of what they eat, what they wear, how they build their houses. All of those things are dependent on the environment that they live in. So the first part of chapter 6 is called the concepts of culture and diffusion. And for this we see that to the Lakota and other indigenous people of North American Great Plains, the bison was an essential part of their culture. It provided meat for nutrition, a hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, and fat for soap. So it became central to their religious beliefs. When European settlers hunted the bison, Lakota culture suffered because their culture was so dependent on the animal. Analyzing culture. Culture includes all of a group's learned behaviors, actions, beliefs, and objects. Visible force seen in a group's actions, possessions, and influence on the landscape. For example, in a large city, you can see people working in offices, factories, and stores, and living in high-rise apartments or suburban homes. You might observe them attending movies, concerts, or sports events. Culture is also an invisible force, guiding people through shared belief systems, customs, and traditions. So there's both visible plus invisible, which equal all of your cultural traits. You can also think of this as like material and non-material parts of culture. Material parts of culture are going to be those tangible things, the clothing that you wear, the food that you eat. The non-material are more those customs, traditions, beliefs, and those types of things. So example, a single cultural artifact such as an automobile may represent many different values. One generation passes its culture to the next in many different ways. So culture is passed down from parents to children. And children learn it in three basic ways. The first is by imitating. So imitation of language, repeating of sounds, that's how we learn how to speak whatever our cultural language is. The second is through informal instruction. A parent reminds a child to say please, for example, as part of the cultural manners of a group. And then also formal instruction. A school teaches the history of a group of people, and also, again, in school you learn those cultural norms. The origins of culture. A cultural hearth is an area in which a unique culture or a specific trait develops. So a hearth is like the origination point, where it actually starts from. For example, the cultural hearth of Islam is in Saudi Arabia in the city of Mecca. The cultural hearth for Judaism would be in Israel in the city of Jerusalem. So other examples, classical Greece for democracy more than 2,000 years ago, New York City for rap music in the 1970s. Specifically, the South Bronx is the actual hearth of where hip hop originates. So geographies study how cultures develop in hearths and then diffuse. So why they start somewhere and then where and how they spread to other places. Taboos are behaviors heavily discouraged by a culture. So basically, taboos are things you're not supposed to do as part of your culture. And most cultures have things that are taboo. For example, in American culture, it would be taboo to eat dog, whereas in parts of Southeast Asia, that's totally normal. For many religions, they have specific food taboos as well. For example, crustaceans for Judaism, pork for Judaism and Islam, and so forth. So again, certain foods are big taboos, porks, insects, things like that. And also, taboos can change over time. In the U.S., it was once taboo for Protestants to marry Catholics, which are two of the largest branches of Christianity, but today it's not that big of a deal. Also, tattoos are another good example. Tattoos used to be very taboo here in American culture. Today, they're pretty much normal. So we really group a culture into two different categories. We have folk, also known as local cultures, and then we have pop, also known as global cultures. So first, let's talk about folk culture. Folk cultures tend to be small, homogeneous groups of people. That means they're all the same. So the same religion, usually the same ethnic group, and so forth. They often live in rural areas, and in fact, it's advantageous for them to live in rural areas so that they can keep their culture isolated. So this isolation allows them to keep their culture in, but also keep pop culture out. So a great example of a folk culture here in the United States would be the Amish. They're also slow to change, meaning that they rely on the traditions of the past. That is what their whole culture is really based on. So folk cultures demonstrate the diverse ways people have adapted to a physical environment. For example, making shelter out of the available resources, whether that's snow like igloos, mud brick houses like adobes, wood, etc. So folk cultures are going to use the materials that they have in their environment. However, people use similar resources like wood differently. So in Scandinavia, which are the countries of Sweden and Norway, they use entire logs to build cabins. Whereas in the American Midwest, you process the trees into boards, built a frame, and attached boards to it. So you're using the same material, but in a different cultural way. So sometimes people independently develop similar responses to similar environments, even if they have absolutely no contact with one another. For example, the Mongols in Central Asia and the Plain Indians in North America have very similar house types. They're called yurts in Asia or teepees here in North America, but it's because their lifestyle was similar, and so the way that their house style developed is going to be similar. So they lived in this flat open land, there was extreme weather, and they were pastoral nomads, meaning that they moved around with animals. So their houses developed to be portable round shelters made from frames and animal skins, the things at their disposal. The spread of cultures. Folk culture provides a unique sense of place and belonging through being the same, all right? So again, that homogeneousness of a folk culture. A sense of place gives inhabitants ties to an area where they live, thus giving them a sense of ownership. So specific geography is very important to folk cultures. People, goods, and ideas move throughout the world, and cultures spread spatially way beyond their hearths. So an example of this, the kiwi fruit was only found from China to New Zealand. However, today, now we can find it all over the world because it has been diffused from that original hearth. Spatial dimensions of culture. There's lots of different ways to define cultural regions, but they're very broad areas where groups share similar but not necessarily identical cultural traits. So Wilbur Zielinski divided the U.S. into 12 major cultural regions, but people still consider themselves part of a larger American culture. So we have American culture, and people around the world would refer to us as having an American accent, and we eat American foods like apple pie. However, we have subcultures within American culture. Here in the South, we have our own American accent, that Southern accent. We also have specific foods here in the South, like fried chicken and sweet tea and those types of things. And so these are the different regions. Now, I want you guys to take a look because students always get confused with where the Midwest is. All right, so please take a look at this map and see that the Midwest includes the states like Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Missouri, Iowa. Those states near the Great Lakes are considered to be the Midwest. Students always want to put it out west, but the Midwest is those states around the Great Lakes. In Unit 1, we learned about the 3 different types of regions, and let's go ahead and review those because they do directly relate to culture. So the first type of region that we learned about is known as a formal, also known as a uniform region. This is an area within which everyone shares in one common or more distinctive characteristic. So that could be things like language, economic activity like agriculture, or environmental property like climate. So an example of a formal region would be the US or Montana. Typically, formal regions have actual defined boundaries. The second type of region that we learned about and are reviewing is a functional, also known as a nodal region. This is an area organized around a node or focal point. So there's a center to this region, and then the further you get away from the center, the less that characteristic dominates. So it gets less and less the further you get away. So an example of this would be like local TV stations. If you're watching a local TV station out of Atlanta, the further you get from Atlanta, the less and less you're going to be able to find that. Another good example is like the fan base for sports teams. So let's take example what we call Braves Country. Braves Country is the fan base for the Atlanta Braves. It's going to be the strongest near Atlanta, and then the further you get away from Atlanta, less and less Braves fans you're going to find. The third type of region is known as a vernacular or a perceptual region. This is a region that is really in your mind. It's part of your mental map, and it's based on how people think about a particular area. So there's not defined boundaries here, and where you draw the boundaries may be different from where I draw the boundaries. And a really good example of this, again, is the South. So what you consider to be part of the South may be different than what I consider to be part of the South. Now, most people are going to include the states of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and so forth. But some people may disagree in terms of West Virginia or even Florida. For example, my definition of the South would include North Florida, but I would not include South Florida because there's a lot of cultural differences in South Florida and the rest of the South. South Florida has a large Hispanic population from places like Cuba and Puerto Rico, and also a lot of snowbirds, people who've moved there from the Northeast for retirement. And so to me, it's not like the rest of the South, and I wouldn't include it. But you could. You including it is not necessarily wrong. So that is what it means to be a perceptual or vernacular region. All right, cultural landscapes. We also have talked about this a little bit in Unit 1 as well. The cultural landscape of a region is the visible reflection of its culture. So anything you can see on the landscape that humans have done. This can be everything from national parks, land set aside for development that reflects a desire to preserve these unique environments. It can also be signage. In Quebec, Canada, you're going to see bilingual signs in both French and English that reflect the desire of French Canadians to retain their heritage. Schools in Pakistan are gender segregated, which reflects that attitude towards male and female roles. Office buildings in Shanghai, China, these massive skyscrapers reflect economic power and a desire to have business in a central, well-known location. So everything from, farmland to buildings to schools to signage, all of these things are part of the cultural landscape. Ethnic enclaves happen because people want to be around people who they have things in common with. So these are clusters of people of the same culture, but surrounded by people of a culture that is not, or that is dominant in the region. So sometimes they reflect the desire to stay apart from the larger society, and other times may reflect the dominant culture's desire to purposely segregate them. So they often contain stores, religious institutions, signs, and architecture that reflect the culture. And sometimes they provide a buffer from discrimination. So some of the most famous ethnic enclaves in the U.S. are places like Chinatown in San Francisco and New York City, Little Italy and Boston. These are all really great examples of these ethnic enclaves. Borders and barriers. Sometimes identifying cultural borders can be hard. Often contain these transition zones where cultures mix and exhibit both traits. For example, when you get close to the border between the U.S. and Mexico, you're really going to see a mix between U.S. and Mexican culture. And in Texas, that's actually called Tex-Mex because of this mixture between the two. So you may start seeing more and more signs in Spanish. You may see more food, more music on the radios in those places as you get closer and closer to that other culture. Cultural realms. Cultural realms are larger than regions. So these are larger areas that include several different regions. And you definitely need to understand these different large cultural realms. So you see here on the map that we live in what is known as Anglo-America. Anglo-America is the US and Canada. All right, called Anglo because of the Anglo-Saxons, which were from Great Britain. So that British culture, because we were mainly British colonies. You see that Central and South America are together called Latin America, and that's because of the Spanish and Portuguese influence in those regions. We see Europe, we also see North Africa and the Middle East grouped together because of that strong Islamic culture. We see below the Sahara Desert in Africa, that's known as Sub-Saharan Africa. We see Indic, which is mainly South Asia. We see Southeast Asia. We see Sino-Japanese, which is going to include East Asia, and then a lot of Eastern Europe, which is called Slavic. So a lot of this also has to do with shared common language and religion. Globalization and cultural change. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, improvements in transportation and communication have shortened the time required for movement, trade, or other forms of interaction between two places. That's known as space-time compression. This has accelerated cultural change around the world, including the spread of English and other European languages as well. So an example of space-time compression can be how much shorter we're able to get things to one place or another. In 1817, freight shipment from Cincinnati to New York took 52 days, just from Ohio to New York City. In 1850, we started to build canals and railroads, which cut that time in half. By 1852, it only took 7 days. Today, because of airplanes and digital information, it can take a few hours to ship something, or just to send information, seconds or less because of email. All right, globalization and popular culture. Globalization is the process of intensified interaction among people, governments, and companies of different countries around the globe. Popular culture consists of cultural traits, things like clothing, music, movies, businesses, that spread quickly across over a large area and are adopted by various groups. So pop culture usually spreads via media, specifically today mainly internet. Some examples could be European soccer, Indian Bollywood movies, Japanese anime. These things have spread across the world, mainly through the internet. And they often promote uniformity in beliefs, values, and the cultural landscape across many cultures. For example, skyscrapers started here in the US, but now we can find skyscrapers in far off places like China or in the United Arab Emirates in cities like Dubai. And so what we see with pop culture is really a loss of individuality. Places start to become more similar. People start to become more similar. And there's both good and bad things to that. So popular culture versus folk culture. Pop culture emphasizes the new rather than preserving tradition. And those who follow a folk culture often resist this change by preserving traditional languages, religions, values, and foods. They may slow down the transition, but rarely stop the traditional culture from changing, especially among younger people. So in this age of globalization, it's becoming very, very difficult for folk cultures to survive because the young in these folk cultures, they want pop culture, and many of them are choosing to abandon their traditional folk languages and music and culture and adopt the larger pop culture of those places around them. For example, in Brazil, as the population expands to the interior of the rainforest, many indigenous people are being exposed to outside groups. Many young people continue to integrate into the larger Brazilian society, which threatens the existence of their folk culture. So many of them start to abandon their traditional languages and beliefs in place. So they learn Portuguese and more of the larger Brazilian culture. On page 97 in your AMSCO books, you will find a really great chart that includes this part right here that does a lot of comparing folk and pop culture. So please take a look at page 97 and make sure you understand kind of these big differences between the two. So this is just going on again to show these bigger differences. So we see huge differences in society, social structure, the difference in the types of diffusion or lack of diffusion in the case of folk culture, the difference in housing materials, food, all of these things vary between folk and pop culture. The geography of gender. So in folk cultures, people often clearly define gender-specific roles. Women many times work in the household, men work outside the house to earn money and serve as religious and political leaders. So we also see globalization and cultural change in terms of pop culture with gender-specific roles diminishing. So we see more gender equality with pop culture. So women have more access to economic resources, more opportunity to work outside the home, and more chances to serve as leaders. Throughout history and many cultures, certain behaviors have been acceptable for only one gender and often only in certain places. Men have operated more freely than women in public spaces, while certain private spaces have been reserved for women. Please take a look at this political cartoon. I think it does a really good job at kind of explaining differences in thought process when it comes to gender. So there's also been a lot of resistance to globalization. The spreading of pop culture has created tension between globalization and local diversity, and that includes most folk cultures. Some cultures with strict gender roles often resent the gender equality often seen in Hollywood movies. Workers in the U.S. resist the transfer of their jobs to overseas locations as well, which is a big element of globalization. Also, speakers of endangered languages resist the spread of English. Cultural hearths are the original source of culture, yet many cultures have spread beyond their hearths. Again, that hearth is where it starts from. The spreading of information, ideas, behaviors, and other aspects of culture over wider areas is known as diffusion. And the two major forms of cultural diffusion come through cultural exchanges by migration and by more indirect means. There's really two big types of diffusion. We have relocation diffusion and expansion diffusion. Relocation diffusion is the spread of a cultural trait by people who migrate and carry their cultural traits with them. So for example, pizza, which was brought to the US by Italian immigrants in the late 1800s. A large-scale example would be European culture, which has spread around the world starting in the 1500s, which would include the fact that we speak English here, and the fact they speak Spanish mainly in Latin America and so forth. Sometimes the areas where migrants settle continue a trait even after it's lost its influence in its hearth. An example of this could be disco music, which evolved in the US in the 1970s. However, it remained popular in Egypt long after it had faded in the US. Another example would be most people who pronounce English like Shakespeare lived, not in England, but in Appalachia. The second type of diffusion is known as expansion diffusion, and this is the spread of cultural traits through direct or indirect exchange without migration. And there's actually four types of expansion diffusion. We have contagious, hierarchical, reverse hierarchical, and stimulus. So let's talk about the first type of expansion diffusion, which is known as contagious. This occurs when a cultural trait spreads continuously outward from its hearth through contact among people. For example, blues music. The hearth of blues music was really the Mississippi River Delta in the southern part of the US. So as musicians outside the hearth heard the music, they began to play it themselves. It slowly spread northward and eventually reached major cities such as St. Louis, Chicago, and New York. Another really good example of contagious diffusion would be like the flu. The flu doesn't care who you are, how much money you have, but if you come in contact with somebody who has it, you are likely to also get it. The second type of expansion diffusion is known as hierarchical. A hierarchy means there's some type of top-down structure. So in hierarchical diffusion, this is the spread of culture outward from the most interconnected places or centers of wealth and importance. So there's some type of top-down structure to this. First, from one important person like a celebrity or a politician, then or a city and a powerful class to another important person, city, or social class. Eventually, the trait is shared with other people, smaller cities, social classes, or less developed countries. Unlike contagious diffusion, hierarchical diffusion may skip some places while moving on to others. Fashion is a great example of hierarchical diffusion. Fashion trends tend to start with celebrities, and they tend to start in specific fashion capitals, which would be Los Angeles, New York, Paris, London, Milan, and Tokyo. So those are the places where these fashion trends originate, or the hearths. And then they might spread to other cities like Atlanta or Houston or Berlin. And then they may spread to other even smaller cities like Birmingham and things like that. Now, they may never reach South Georgia, rural South Georgia, and that's what makes it hierarchical. It's a top-down type of spread. Another great example of diffusion of culture is cell phone technology. In the 1980s, expensive and mostly owned by wealthy people in large cities in more developed countries. However, as cell phone networks grew and cell phones became more mass-produced, they eventually spread to a wider market. Today, cell phones have diffused throughout the world. Not only does everybody in developed countries have them, but most people in less developed countries have them as well, including people who lives in the slums of Nairobi in sub-Saharan Africa. The next type of expansion diffusion we're going to talk about is reverse hierarchical. And this is the process in which a trait diffuses from a lower class to a higher class. A really good example of this would be tattoos. Between the 1940s and the 1960s, tattoos were a symbol of low social status and were associated with three types of places: seaport towns, so dock workers and sailors, military bases, and prisons. So it was those lower classes of society who had tattoos. However, By the 1970s, the custom had diffused throughout many segments of society and geographic area. Another example of this could be Walmart, which started in rural Arkansas and today is nearly everywhere in the US. Also, some fashion trends can also be reverse hierarchical. The sagging of the pants would actually be a good example of that. That started with the lower classes and actually people in prison, and then it spread all the way up to, Justin Bieber. The last type of expansion diffusion that we need to talk about is known as stimulus diffusion. And this occurs when people in a culture adopt an underlying idea or process from another culture, but modify it because they reject one trait of it. A good example of this is fast food or McDonald's, specifically in India, where many people in India who are strict Hindus do not eat meat. However, they have adopted the idea of eating fast food. But these fast food restaurants like McDonald's have changed and adapted their menu by making vegetarians and other non-beef type of burgers. So that would be stimulus diffusion. They are adopting the big idea, but without every single trait of it. Another example would be Europeans who adopted the use of lightweight, beautiful porcelain dishes from China, but rejected the high cost of importing them. So when Germans found the right type of clay to make their own, they modified the process of obtaining porcelain by making it in Europe. So they took this idea from somewhere else and then they modified it to fit their own culture. Contact between cultures. Diffusion describes the ways that cultures spread, and as they spread, they come into contact with other cultures. This interaction is one of the driving forces in human history, and it can have several types of results, including acculturation, assimilation, multiculturalism, and nativism. Acculturation occurs when an ethnic or immigrant group moving to a new area adopts the values and practices of the larger group that has received them, while still maintaining major elements of their own culture. For example, in the 1880s, a family migrated from Denmark to a Danish enclave in Iowa. They gave most of their 10 children traditional Danish names, such as Inger and Niels, and ate Danish foods. Within 3 generations, though, their descendants, they still ate Danish foods, but had names common in U.S. culture, such as Susan, Dave, and Jim. So you adopt some of the things from the new culture while still keeping some of your own. For example, you move to a new place, you learn the new language, but at home you still practice and use your traditional language. That would be acculturation. Assimilation happens when an ethnic group can no longer be distinguished from the receiving group. So basically this means that ethnic group, they completely ignore all of their former culture and just completely adopt the larger culture around them. So the ethnic group becomes more affluent, they leave their ethnic areas. However, what this means is they've lost their traditional cultures. So however, complete assimilation is rare, as at least one trait usually persists. Many times that's religion. So for example, the grandchildren of immigrants from India may no longer speak Hindi or eat traditional Indian food daily, but they might still practice their Hindi faith. Often, 3rd and 4th generations will display a resurgence of pride and organize festivals, learn the ethnic language, and revitalize ethnic neighborhoods. That's something that we see happen here. There's also something known as forced assimilation, and this has actually happened throughout U.S. history, specifically to Native American groups. The U.S. government forced Native American children into boarding schools where they would not allow them to speak their native languages, wear their native dress, or anything. They basically wanted them to become what the government deemed as Americans, speaking English and so forth. Multiculturalism is the coexistence of several cultures in one society, with the ideal of all cultures being valued and worthy of study. It is believed that the interaction of cultures enriches the lives of all. And when people call the U.S. a melting pot, that's usually kind of what they mean by it. That, the best vision of America is this multicultural America. However, when different groups interact, this can bring conflicts, as people and groups with different values, beliefs, and customs often clash. Many people feel that their culture and their ways are the right way, and so it's hard for them to get along. And this is true not only in the US, but everywhere in the world, and has been true throughout human history. When different groups of people interact, many times that brings conflict. So minority groups face prejudice and discrimination. For example, Syrian refugees fleeing civil war in 2011 faced opposition from some Americans who feared that refugees could be terrorists. And so a lot of people didn't want refugees to come to the US. And that was just now. That's been true again throughout history. Some conflicts between two cultures become harsh, and nativist or nativism is this anti-immigrant attitude that may form among the cultural majority, sometimes bringing violence or government actions against the immigrant or minority group. This has also been a common theme throughout U.S. history. Whether it was in the early 1800s with the Irish, we saw a lot of nativism, and you would see signs in windows that say no Irish need apply, and there would be political cartoons demonizing the Irish. Same thing is going to be true a little later with the Italians, and then today more recently with people from Latin America. So this can be towards one group of people or general dislike of people from all other countries, which is known again as xenophobia. So another example would be opposition in the U.S. to Roman Catholic immigrants in the 1800s and early 1900s, which were mainly coming from places like Italy and then also some Eastern European countries. And finally, the diffusion of deadly diseases. As the world becomes more and more globalized, disease and the spread of disease becomes an ever bigger problem. In 1918, we saw an influenza epidemic. It was actually a pandemic because it did become global. Epidemic means it's regional. Pandemic becomes global. But this was known as the Spanish flu, and it's a great example of contagious diffusion. So immediately after World War I, the Spanish flu killed 3 times more people than the actual war itself. And the source of the outbreak is unclear, though actually most evidence points that the Spanish flu did not begin in Spain. In fact, most likely actually began here in the U.S. on a chicken farm in Kansas. It's called the Spanish flu because at the time Spain was actually the most open about reporting what was going on with the pandemic. So East Coast American cities quickly became hubs for the diffusion as soldiers returning home carried the virus or contracted it at port. Then they would travel home by train, spreading it throughout the country. Now today we're even more connected than we were in 1918, and that's why all of these epidemiologists have always feared that we were going to have another outbreak. We saw small outbreaks with things like SARS and MERS and Ebola and Zika, but as we all know, right now we are dealing with the largest pandemic since the 1918 Spanish flu with COVID-19. And I'm sure you guys all know that, the use of planes is really what accelerated the spread of COVID-19. People flying from Wuhan, China to other parts of the world, to Europe, to the United States. That is how COVID-19 spread so quickly around the world. And so it's an example of globalization and the spread of disease. All right, guys, so that concludes Chapter 6. We will pick up with Chapter 7, which will be on language.